there's a need for people to actually focus on conservation and awareness of this species of bats.
We're noticing the more we look, the closer we look, the more we see evidence of enormous population declines.
The Philippines is a very interesting and complex place, and that has a lot to do with why there are so many species of bats there.
Right now, we've described 78 species of bats in the Philippines, and that number is actually just the beginning, and it's rising the more research we do on taxonomy, systematics. This number is inevitably going to increase. There's a great variety of types of bats. Some are enormous, some are these flying foxes that look like small dogs with wings, and others are extremely tiny, maybe 2 grams in size, look like little butterflies flying around.
One of the things that we see is that most of the island groups in the Philippines each have their own unique species of bats. There are some that are shared, maybe half, but half of them, roughly, live only in one limited area.
Philippine bats are one of the most interesting wildlife in the Philippines, considering that there are many of them that are endemic to each island or for Philippines alone, and that many of these species are restricted to different types of habitat, or are restricted to caves, or some of them are even restricted to specific elevations.
Because of the Philippines' geological history, of the country mostly having developed as a result of volcanic activity, typically what you see is one volcano in the middle of the island, and then around the edge of the island there's this very extensive area of limestone, what's often referred to as karst. Some of the other islands are the result of essentially pressure ridges, where there's just been a tremendous amount of geological force that has uplifted one of those areas of old coral reefs and limestone. The whole island is made up of limestone, essentially. These areas of limestone then are scattered all over the Philippines. There are thousands and thousands of caves. They're extremely important habitats for bats everywhere they occur.
Over half of these bat species in the Philippines use at some point caves, and many of these species are absolutely dependent on large caves. A lot of people ask, why should we care about bats? These are strange things. Most people are fearful of them, but while we're sleeping, they are actually working for us.
Yung mga paniking nakatira sa kuweba sa Pilipinas ay mahalaga sa atin dahil unang-una, sila tumutulong sa tinatawag natin na pollination.
Primarily for the entire Philippines, bat serves as seed dispersers and pollinators, and the #1 pollinator of highly important fruit trees like durian and many other commercial fruits. aside from that, they help reforest most of the degraded areas that we have here.
They are foresters. They are natural pest control agents.
Bats are extremely important economically for control of insect pests.
Bats are one of the natural pest control in our farmlands, in our natural vegetation, and they play a significant ecological role in the Philippines environment and biodiversity as well.
About 2/3 of the bat species in the Philippines are insect-eating bats. These bats eat an enormous amount of insects. For some species, it's been estimated they can eat up to half their body weight in insects a night. And if you multiply that by thousands of bats that might congregate in a cave, when those bats go out at night, they're flying over the rice fields and eating large quantities of insects that might be harmful to those rice crops. So in this way, they're natural insecticides.
Sa tingin ko, isa sa pinakamahalaga talagang tulong ng paniki ay yung hindi natin nakikita actually, yung nangyayari doon sa loob ng kuweba.
Bats are what we call ecosystem engineers.
Yung mga paniki ay napakahalaga nung ginagawa nila na sila yung nagdadala ng pagkain ng mga insekto at iba pang buhay sa kuweba sa pamamagitan ng guano.
They bring nutrients from outside the cave and they bring it in by defecating in the cave, and their guano that builds up is essentially, it's a substrate, it's a whole world.
So, napakalaki ng tulong ng mga panike para mapamanatili yung buhay na yon o yung biodiversity sa loob ng kuweba.
Bats provide a habitat for other species within the cave. Crickets, whip scorpions, other small, even mites, smaller insects, and there are even frogs and geckos that rely on those insects that rely on the guano for the bats. So it's a really complicated food web, all contained, in the cave ecosystem. Many of these species are found only in these caves, only in the Philippines. And in fact, if you remove bats, they're not bringing in the guano, they're not creating the substrate, not creating the landscape or providing the nutrients for these other species, and those species will go extinct.
Bats stay in the caves and they get fertilizer, we call it guano.
Guano is very useful to other species, creating a habitat, but it's also very useful to humans. Guano has been used for a long time as a fertilizer for fields in the Philippines and around the world. And it can be sustainably used if it's harvested in a sustainable way.
90% of all the guano harvesters really have unsustainable practice in harvesting.
The stories we've heard in the field are that people will smoke the bats out. They'll create fires to smoke the bats out before they go in to remove the guano. And if you do this enough, bats won't come back.
Like for example, there are large species of insect bats that requires large chambers in order to have a viable population. And if these caves are frequently visited or disturbed, then it would affect the population in that area. If there's no alternative caves nearby, then the population would suffer.
Guano can be probably sustained.
There are ways, I think, that it could be done in a way that will not scare, the bats off, where they'll keep coming back. Unfortunately, most guano harvesting is not done in a sustainable way.
The best way forward for guano collection might be to study first how this guano collection may be sustained by not harming the bats.
To harvest guano in a sustainable way, I think one needs to make an effort to harvest guano during periods of time where bats are not reproductively active, where there aren't young in the cave. Bats have very low reproductive rates. Each individual will give birth to 1 or 2 young per year. So this becomes important when we talk about factors that will decrease the bat population rapidly because they can't rebound as quickly as, say, a mouse could.
With protecting bats, cave-living bats in particular, certainly one of the most important things is to reduce the amount of mining activity that goes on, whether it's for guano or for limestone.
Limestone mining is very prevalent in the Philippines, both inside and outside of caves. Obviously, this disturbs bats greatly. When there's, equipment, noise, people in the cave, bats just aren't going to stick around. And unfortunately, what we don't know and what we'd like to know is how long before bats return and how can we encourage them to return after the mining has stopped.
Isa sa pinaka-mapamuksang gawain sa mga paniking nakatira sa loob ng kuweba natin ay yung hunting.
Many people would hunt them for food and for pollutant.
Kana siya wa gyud nay hugaw kay mga prutas ra may kanon musuyo pra man sila duga dayon kuan mao nang lami kuno na kaunon para nila
bila kanang nay mga pagsanggutan kanang kada kyo baga direr ba nang makuha din napoy kabog nga kuan sa lubi magbitay siya kuha na namo wa pa mga una na sagaran mga dagkong tao kay kuan anso na siya
amo nga banid na kay amo mga kanon na sila gyud kay di man amo ausi ka litag makuha na sila. Aban may ugda ko bisan pag unsay bulok nimo mo ginay among kuan kay mo may tuyo walay pili kay pareha mang makaon.
May mga kuweba na halos wala ng laman dahil sa ubos na ng mga nangunguha nung panike.
Walay maipikter ang dagay makuha ni mawala ni dinhe. Kay kanini awa man jud gagamit nga wa may kalibutan kung sa importante pa ni pero kanang mukaon kay kadaghanan ni talag sarap pud ng taong mukaon ani.
Before, I used to assume that people would actually just collect bats, especially targeting those that are big. It's not necessarily for food, but it's just only simply because they needed something for pulutan. We call it pulutan, like a pika-pika food that you used to drink with alcohol or something.
It appears in the Philippines that bats are not a staple in the diet, at least in the communities we've worked in. If we were to restrict hunting or collecting of bats, it wouldn't impact the daily nutritional intake of these communities. Given that bats reproduce so slowly, if, like we've heard again and again, people go in and take a half a sack of bats out, these populations are going to decline very rapidly. And if this happens, even just once a month or once every 6 months, that bat population is not going to have time to recover.